Good morning. Welcome to Prayerful Flow. I'm Christy, and if you have been to this class before, welcome back. If you are new to the class, I will go ahead and take a few moments to explain what to expect. So we are bringing Namaste's virtual yoga studio all the way to Fort Myers, Florida for the time being, where I've relocated with my husband to provide some care for my mother-in-law. So we're sending out positive vibes for strength and courage that we've been doing amidst this pandemic, but that we continue to do during this time. So in advance, if there's any kind of birds and wind and breeze in the background, we will just add that to our scene and our practice. Since we don't have music, why not have birds? So we begin class with scripture. You'll hear the passage twice, and I'll give you the directions when we get there, and then we'll transition to some movement and then end class with some guided prayer, or maybe hear the reading one more time before we have a few moments of Shavasana. So to access today's class, I recommend maybe something to pad your knees. You can always double your mat over or use like a rolled up blanket or towel. And then also, if you have two blocks, you might find that to help deepen some of the poses or bring the earth a little bit higher up to you. And if you don't have blocks, actually my husband is in the background using a shoebox size Rubbermaid container that he will wrap a towel around for extra padding. You can do something like that, but also if you don't have anything like that, you can, I will cue the poses. You don't necessarily need the blocks. So to begin class today, I invite you to come into a bound angle pose, and I'll give you two options. You can come all the way onto your back and make it more of a reclined bound angle pose, or we'll kind of use the blocks to modify a seated option. So coming onto, pulling any flesh away from your sit bones, bringing a bend to your knees are wide, and you're bringing the soles of your feet together. And then, like I said, option to recline, you can use that rolled up blanket to kind of lift your heart a little bit. If you want to recline all the way onto your back, I'll model that really quickly. So if you were using a rolled up blanket, you would have some lift to your heart, and then I'd invite you to either bring your arms out open wide or above your head. So those are your options if you're going to take the reclined pose. For more of a somewhat reclined, somewhat seated option, we're going to bring the blocks into play and kind of make it more of like a supported fish bound angle, but using the blocks on the higher height. So I would invite you to take one block and put it on the medium height and one block on the taller height. And this is where the tallest height is where your head is going to rest, and this medium height is going to come just in between your shoulder blades at that just right spot where it feels like a really passive and sweet shoulder opening. So coming this way, you're still keeping the pose with your legs, and you're resting and adjusting the blocks into that just right spot. So the back of your head should rest comfortably on the tallest height, and then you might be adjusting the lower block just to be in that right spot between your shoulder blades. If you feel any pinching or tension, I would invite you to lower the block or maybe even come onto that blanket. But if it feels like it's just a good passive stretch, it should feel kind of relieving, and you should just notice that lift in your heart. And again, I invite you to open your arms wide. Maybe you have the bandwidth to get your arms over your head, but again, nothing painful here, because we're going to be listening to the gospel and also kind of working through coming into our breath. So I'll let you get settled. I will be in a seated posture since we'll be reading. So as you're making adjustments on your mat and in your space, I invite you to start to bring your awareness to your breath, noticing if your natural breath is kind of quick and shallow this morning, noticing if it's easy and deep, and just slowly inhaling in through your nose and exhaling out through your mouth, spying out any tension you're bringing to our prayer and our practice. And then at the pace of your own breath, just begin taking a steady inhale in through your nose and exhaling through your nose, bringing to mind not only an openness to God's presence, but also a welcome and an invitation to God's presence. So He's always near, always here, but we're scanning our hearts and looking to invite Him into our space. I'm going to read the gospel passage from Matthew 22. You're going to hear the passage twice. The first time, I invite you to simply listen. Jesus again, in reply, spoke to the chief priests and elders of the people in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast, but they refused to come. A second time, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those invited, behold, I have prepared my banquet. My calves and fattened cattle are killed, and everything is ready. Come to the feast.' Some ignored the invitation and went away, one to his farm, another to his business. The rest laid hold of his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged and sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, 'The feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy to come. Go out, therefore, into the main roads, and invite to the feast whomever you find.' The servants went out into the streets and gathered all they found, bad and good alike, and the hall was filled with guests." Go ahead and take a long inhale in, and you sigh out your exhale. Maybe bringing your knees together if you feel like you need some movement before we begin transitioning to our second reading. Maybe you're windshield wiping your knees from side to side, maybe extending your legs long if that feels better to you. Otherwise, preparing our hearts for our second reading. This time I invite you to notice any word or phrase that catches your attention. And notice if the word or phrase is something that brings you peace or consolation, or notice if it's something that challenges you or you feel a slight resistance regarding. And if that's the case, I invite you to simply ask God to soften your heart around that, because that could be the Holy Spirit at work too. Jesus again, in reply, spoke to the chief priests and elders of the people in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast, but they refused to come. A second time, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those invited, behold, I have prepared my banquet. My calves and fattened cattle are killed, and everything is ready. Come to the feast.' Some ignored the invitation and went away, one to his farm, another to his business. The rest laid hold of his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged and sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, "The feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy to come. Go out, therefore, into the main roads, and invite to the feast whomever you find." The servants went out into the streets and gathered all they found, good and bad alike, and the hall was filled with guests. Let any word or phrase that caught your attention or is coming to mind and catching your attention now, I'm gonna let that settle. Perhaps sealing it in as an intention for your prayer and practice this morning. Take a long inhale in, long exhale out. And then when you're ready, begin to gently remove any props that you have, just putting them to the side, knowing that you might be using them again, so having them available, and just coming up to a seated pose with our legs out extended in front of us. Again, option to raise the earth if your hips are tight or your hamstrings are tight. Just adding a couple inches to raise your hips above your knees, maybe bringing a micro bend to your knees, rolling your shoulders onto your back, sitting tall, imagining the cord, maybe pulling from the crown of your head, pulling your spine straight, sitting up tall. Let's again roll our shoulders onto our back. Maybe even bringing some movement into that, using our breath. On an inhale, we raise our shoulders up. On an exhale, we let them draw softly onto our back. And then as you're kind of beginning that movement, bringing some warmth and heat and breath to our body, I invite you, when you are on the place where you're rolling your shoulders and bringing them onto your back, I invite you to squeeze your shoulder blades together. So maybe even more tension than you'd bring to a yoga pose, just to really feel what like squeezing or gripping or tightening feels like. And then release that. And then on an inhale again, bring your shoulders blades up and then release them softly. So your shoulder blades rest softly onto your back, and just notice how that feels. So when I'm cueing things like return your shoulder blades onto your back body, it's kind of an ambiguous cue, but that means like bringing them to their resting place. So you're not necessarily squeezing to get there, but just kind of softening your shoulder blades onto your back. It brings some lift to your chest. So some of our poses today, we're going to be doing that. So I wanted to prep you for it. So on an inhale, I invite you to extend your arms to the sky, maybe even looking up towards your fingertips. And then on an exhale, draw your heart forward, so you're leading with your chest, keeping your spine long, and just extending to whichever version of this pose maintains the integrity of the length of your spine while still giving you a nice hamstring stretch. So not necessarily having to collapse over our legs, but just keeping our heart forward, our spine long, and really feeling our hamstrings start to wake up. And breathe. Just enjoying taking a long inhale in, noticing even if as you're holding this pose and breathing through this pose, you're starting to feel your hips kind of loosen up and soften. On your next inhale, begin to rise, bringing your spine to neutral, lifting your arms up overhead, and then exhaling your hands, returning your hands to your sides. time bringing your hands to either side of your hips and then making sure they're in line, so your wrist is in line with your shoulder. So from shoulder to elbow to wrist, you're long and lengthened. Next, I invite you, and this is where you might want to bring the blocks into play if you're having a hard time bringing your hands to the earth, if that doesn't feel right to you. Option to use blocks here to help bring some height to the pose. It also might help you lengthen if you are bringing the blocks in. So I invite you to bring a bend to your knees, placing the soles of your feet on the mat. And then I invite you to lift your hips, engage your core, engage your glutes. Again, not necessarily overly squeezing, but just bringing some engagement and some energy, and lift to like you're coming to a tabletop, but in the reverse. And then letting your head and neck come to a neutral spot, so you're not like dangling your head, you're not like straining your neck, and your shoulders shouldn't be coming up towards your ears, but just finding some heat, building some strength. And then on an exhale, lower your hips to the mat, extend your legs long. And so using some breath and movement, we're going to go through that a couple more times, just a little more quickly, but now that you know where we're going. So our inhale, we bring a bend to our knees and our feet to the mat. Our exhale, we engage our arms, lift our chest, lift our hips, coming into that reverse table. Inhale to lower our hips. Exhale, return our legs long. Let's try that one more time. Inhale, bend your knees. Exhale, lift to reverse table. Inhale, lower your hips. Exhale, extend out. Then inhale, raise your arms. And then on an exhale, lead with your heart forward. This time, letting it be an easy stretch. Maybe curling your spine, maybe reaching to your feet, just as a nice counter pose. On an inhale, begin to bring your spine back to neutral. And then however you would like to get there, we will come to a regular tabletop meeting on hands and knees. Turn this way for instructional purposes. So coming to hands and knees, and again, same thing here, we're checking in on our alignment. Shoulders, elbows, and wrists are in one line, and our hips are in line with our knees. Maybe patting your knees here if that's calling to you. We'll just begin to use our breath to take a couple rounds of cat and cow pose. So as we know, in cat pose, we're curling our spine, pushing our back body away from the earth, pushing into the mat, pressing, feeling that stretch, waking up our back. And then on an inhale, we drop our belly and be really mindful, since we're doing some heart opening poses, of leading with your heart, drawing your shoulders back onto your back body, gaze is up, looking outward, and maybe even pausing here for a full round of breath or two, just focusing on opening up your heart and the lift in your heart, maybe coming back to that word or phrase that was your intention. And then after you've completed a round of breath or two, just taking to the pace of your own breath, one more round of cat-cow to kind of rinse out that pose. then when you're ready, we'll come onto our knees, bringing our hips towards our heels, and maybe just rolling your shoulders open. Might be a movement that just continues to feel good as you release tension and move through our practice. And then next, I invite you to simply extend your right arm out in front of you with your palm open, and then use your left hand to just bring a wrist stretch to your right hand. So you're pulling your right finger back. You should feel a nice stretch down the length of your forearm. Pausing here to breathe. And then when you're ready, go ahead and release the stretch, maybe do a couple wrist circles, and then extend your left arm out long and stretch on the opposite side. So you're pulling your left fingertips back and feeling a nice stretch along your left forearm. Again, when you're ready, go ahead and release that stretch, maybe doing a couple wrist circles. And then from here, keep staying on our knees. I'm just turning to face the camera for instructional purposes. I invite you to extend your arms to the sky, and then place your left arm on your head, and then using it to guide into a gentle neck stretch. And then with your right arm, you have the option of extending your right arm long, pressing through your fingertips and feeling that long line of energy stretch across your neck. Another option would be to even just bring some traction to the pose by using your fingertips to gently massage down your right shoulder and your left fingertips up your head. So again, you're not yanking your head, you're just gently pressing and just bringing some gentle traction that might feel like a good stretch for your neck. And breathing. Another option would be to look at your bicep and see how that changes the stretch in your neck. After your next round of breath, release your left arm to the sky, return your head back to neutral, return your right arm to the sky, maybe even take a gentle baby back bend looking towards the sky. And then let's bring that same stretch to the opposite side by placing our right arm on the left side of our head, extending maybe our left arm long, and gently bringing a stretch by bringing your right ear towards your right shoulder. And breathing, again, maybe using a little bit of traction to pull your shoulders away from your neck, if that feels right to you. Or maybe turning your head gently to look at your bicep and see how that changes the stretch. After your next full round of breath, release your left arm, gently return your head back to center. Extend your arms long to the sky. And again, maybe bringing a gentle back bend to the pose, opening up your heart, lifting your heart. And then exhale, bring your palms together, return your hands to heart center. Maybe focusing back on your word or your phrase, just repeating it to yourself. And just bringing to mind the notion of being open to an invitation, to an idea, to a relationship. And then when you're ready, we will meet in a downward facing dog. So however you would like to get there. Whether through hands and knees, or standing and finding your way there, or just making our way there. So downward facing dog. First one of the practice, so you may want to pedal out your legs by bending one knee and straightening the other. Bringing your ears in between your biceps, maybe shaking your head out yes and no. Noticing if you're carrying any tension in your jaw. And if you are, I invite you to take a long inhale in through your nose and then sigh it out through your mouth, maybe even bringing your tongue out and just sighing out any kind of tension or anything you're carrying. Maybe even bending both knees and letting them hover towards the mat before lifting your seat and getting a nice stretch along the backs of your legs, your lower back. On an inhale, look between your hands. Either walk your feet up or step your feet towards your hands, coming towards the top of the mat into a forward fold. Again, making sure you keep a bend to the knees. If you have vertigo issues or blood pressure issues, you always have an option to come into halfway lift. So forward fold. On an inhale, let's come to that halfway lift, placing our hands above our knees, keeping our spine long, and again, rolling our shoulder blades onto our back body, keeping our gaze down. Exhale, return to forward fold. And then on an inhale, let's slowly rise together, one vertebrae at a time. Inhaling, bringing our hands to the sky, maybe looking up before bringing our hands to heart center and folding all the way down to the earth. Planting our hands, stepping back to a plank or modified plank. So we're stepping our legs back. Modified plank, you can just simply lower your knees to the earth. Breathing here. Noticing where your shoulders are. Are you kind of collapsing into your shoulders, or are you, even from plank pose, able to draw your shoulders back? Let's lower all the way onto our belly, whichever way you want to get there. Maybe through knees, chest, and chin. Your toes can be curled under or flat. And then let's come into a Sphinx pose by extending our forearms out in front of us. So our elbows are kind of at the sides of our rib cage. Our forearms are extended out. Our fingers are spread. And really find yourself using all of from your elbows to the tips of your fingers, really press into the mat. So again, not that like pressing as hard as you can as though you're trying to move the earth away from you, but just enough tension that you feel that you're pressing into your fingertips, that you're pressing into your hands, even using your forearms and your elbows to support you in this back bend. Your gaze is down your nose towards the floor. And again, you're drawing your heart forward, engaging your core, keeping energy in your legs active, making this a really active and energetic Sphinx pose. Take one long inhale here, and then with your exhale, lower your forehead back to the mat, drawing your hands next to your rib cage, and then coming back up to a downward facing dog, either through hands and knees or pressing yourself all the way up. From downward facing dog, first on an inhale, extend your right leg to the sky for three-legged dog. pressing through your heel, maybe even rotating your ankle one way and then the other way. And then stretch, 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 like you're extending through your foot, making your leg 3 inches longer than it actually is before lowering your right leg to meet your left. And let's take that same stretch on the opposite side. So extending your left leg long for three-legged dog. First pressing through your heel, and then maybe rotating your ankle one way, rotating your ankle the other way, maybe even pointing and flexing your foot if that feels good. And then just energetically press through your heel, really feeling the length through your legs from a long line of energy, from the tips of your fingers all the way down or up your body, extending out through your left leg before lowering it to the earth. Left foot meets right, returning to downward facing dog. On an inhale, again, let's extend our right leg long for three-legged dog, but this time bending our knee, drawing it through our chest, stepping our right foot forward for a low lunge. I'm going to again turn for instructional purposes. So coming into a low lunge here with our right leg forward, and just this is where you might want to bring something to pad your knee if that feels right for you. But just settling in and extending your left hip, your left leg back to get your hip stretched kind of just where it's an intense stretch, but it's not causing you any kind of pain or pinching or pins and needles. It's just a really good deep hip opener. And again, our alignment, we're checking in from our knee to our ankle. We're really using our front foot as an anchor. On an inhale, I invite you to bring your hands to your knee. And again, lifting your heart forward. So the same cue I used where we imagined that string pulling the crown of our head to make our spine long. This time imagine one lifting from your chest. So your head is still an active member of this whole posture, but we're really trying to focus on lifting our chest, opening our heart. And then I invite you to bring your arms behind you, and then maybe placing your hands on your back pockets, or if you have the bandwidth to interlace your hands together, really bringing you a deeper shoulder stretch and lifting your heart. So this time really imagining that cord, lifting your chest, lifting your heart, really coming into the openness that we talked about in our scripture passage, being open to any invitation. Noticing how your breath is changing. And an inhale, just as slowly as we build this pose, I invite you to return your hands to your knees first maybe, then return your palms to the earth, and then just as a counter pose, maybe sink back, bringing your hips towards your left heel, popping your right leg forward, straightening it, popping your foot up, and just coming into a hamstring stretch. An option to use the blocks if that helps you access the pose. Breathing. On an inhale, come back, straightening, bending your straight leg, and then returning your right foot back to meet your right knee back to meet your left knee, coming back into a tabletop pose. And then let's sink back for a moment into child's pose. So bring your toes together, your knees wide, just sinking down into child's pose. Maybe extending your arms long or bringing your hands together above your forehead. Pausing to check in on your breath. If your breath has gotten choppy, maybe using the length of your inhale, counting to 4 or 6, and then your exhale, evening it out by counting to the same number. And then when you're ready, let's make our way back up to a downward facing dog, maybe from tabletop or just coming right into a downward facing dog. And again, I'm going to switch directions on you for instructional purposes. But this time you kind of know where we're headed, so extend your left leg long for three-legged dog. Engaging your core, draw your left knee in through your chest, stepping it forward for low lunge on the opposite side, lowering your right knee to the earth, patting it if necessary, and just wiggling your right knee back or forward to wherever it needs to be so that the stretch is intense enough but not so intense that you can't hold it for several rounds of breath. And then inhale, bring your hands to your knees, settling in, noticing what you notice, breathing, making sure your hips are still square, facing forward, so your left hip is actually feeling like it would be drawing back a little while your right hip is coming forward, so you're keeping them even. And then extending our arms back, lifting our heart, and then options for arms to go to back pockets or maybe interlaced behind you. And just opening up, raising your heart to the sky, breathing. On an inhale, bring your hands to your knee. Maybe extending your arms to the sky one more time. And then exhaling to frame your front foot. Before pressing into your hands, curling your right toe to lift your right knee. And then step your left foot back to meet your right, coming into plank or modified plank. And then option to take a flow through here, or we will meet in downward facing dog. So however you would like to get there. So from downward facing dog, I invite you to extend your right leg long for three-legged dog. Option to bend, twist, and open. Pausing here, noticing if you've collapsed into your left shoulder and maybe just sending some strength and balance through your right hand so your upper body is evenly supported. Extend your right leg long back, three-legged dog, before lowering it down to meet right foot to meet your left. And then let's take that same stretch on the opposite side. Extend your left leg long, three-legged dog. Bend, twist, and open on this side. breathing. Returning your leg to three-legged dog before lowering your left foot to meet your right. And look between your hands, step between your hands, forward fold. On an inhale, let's lift halfway. Exhale, forward fold. Inhale, rise to stand. Let's just take a crescent stretch towards our right. So clasping, not collapsing, you're clasping your left wrist with your right hand, coming into a full body stretch towards the right. Lengthening, and again, noticing, softening your shoulders onto your back body. Inhale, back to center, switch hands. Exhale, crescent stretch opposite side. Inhale, back to center, and then exhale, fold all the way through heart center. Inhale to lift halfway. Exhale, forward fold. You can either step back right into downward facing dog or take one more flow through if that's calling to you today. Then from downward facing dog, I invite you to lower your knees to the earth and bringing your blocks and any padding for your knee, having that handy. So I'm going to go ahead and pad my knees here. So another significant heart opening pose is camel pose. And it's an intense back bend. But again, as I've said before, this is yoga practice, not yoga perfection. So even if camel pose is the full expression of the pose is not in your practice, we can do some camel prep to begin opening our hearts, opening up our shoulders, and increasing the range of our back bends in order to grow towards camel pose. So I would invite you, there's different options for how you can use the blocks. You can place one by each ankle, and that would be an option for you. Another option would be to bring some height to it. So making kind of a T with the blocks or whatever it is that you're using to kind of stack. So they're just a little bit higher than the typical block height. You want it, so you can see I'm adding some height there. So coming into camel pose, again, we're looking at alignment here. So our shoulders are in line with our hips, are in line with our knees. And a common thing with camel pose is we'll tend to try to strive to get ourselves into the pose and our hips pop forward. And that is not maintaining the integrity of the pose. So we're really focusing on opening and lifting our hearts. So that is the goal. Again, if you've not done this pose before, the goal is really leading with our hearts and not our hips. So coming into camel pose, first I invite you to simply just, come forward, feeling long in the spine, and then reach your arms back like we've been doing through practice. And then your prep for camel pose, if this is an intense stretch for you, bringing your hands to back pockets and focusing on bringing your elbows together rather than splaying them might be your expression of camel pose. And this is you getting the benefits of camel pose because you're opening, you're leading with your heart, and you're deepening your bandwidth in your shoulders and your back in order to become more open to the pose. So this might be your stop. Another option would be to interlace your fingers like we did in that low lunge stretch and just play with drawing our head back and our hearts forward, and that could be your camel pose. Just pausing there to breathe. Another option would be to reach behind you and play with that sensation. I know I don't always like my growth point is not knowing where I'm reaching when I'm reaching back. And that's something I've worked through or have to continue working through. So my growth point is just reaching with my hands and finding and touching the blocks. So that could be your camel pose, or always an option to play with reaching towards the back, towards your heels if you have that flexibility. So play with the different options. And again, we're focusing on breathing and opening our hearts, and not necessarily twisting our bodies into a back bend that is not serving us. So take a few rounds of breath, noticing what you notice. Again, also, we're not like straining our necks or bringing like our shoulders up to our ears in order to kind of bend backward. Remember to breathe using the length of your breath, feeling your heart and your chest rise, but also your breath in your diaphragm all the way into your belly. Enjoy this heart opening, and then when you're ready, gently bring yourself out of the pose, removing any props. Putting them to the side, and then as a counter pose, come into just a puppy dog or a child's pose, whichever you prefer, but just something to kind of go inward and lengthen your arms forward. So for a puppy dog, you're sinking your heels, your hips back to your heels, and you're almost coming onto your chest and lengthening out, lengthening your arms forward. And breathing. Taking a long inhale, a long, slow exhale. As we begin to slow down our practice, coming more inward. And then when you're ready, slowly begin to walk yourself back up to a kneeling position. Letting your hips come back onto your heels. Maybe taking a few more shoulder shrugs if that has been soothing or relief for you during our practice. And then when you're ready, kind of return back gradually to the earth in the same way that we began practice. So extend your legs long out in front of you, maybe sitting on a blanket or pulling the flesh away from your sits bones, and then bringing the soles of your feet together for bound angle pose. Maybe even using blocks to support your knees if that is something you prefer. And on an inhale, let's extend our arms to the sky. And then on an exhale, leading with our hearts, come forward, folding over your legs, reaching towards your feet, letting your hands fall where they may. Maybe it's on your feet, maybe it's on your ankles or your calves. And just leaning forward, looking down towards your feet or towards your mat. Maybe even lowering onto elbows, but kind of just curling in. Focusing on your breath. On an inhale, just as slowly as you came into the pose, begin to use your hands and arms to kind of walk yourself back up to a seated pose. Maybe bringing your knees together, windshield wipering your legs from side to side. And then when you're ready, we'll gently make our way all the way onto our back. Still keeping a bend to the knees, your feet on the mat. Lift your feet to make a 90-degree angle, bend to your knees, and then when you're ready, lower your knees towards the right, keeping your shoulders on the mat, coming into a spinal twist, looking over your left shoulder, maybe placing your right hand on your left thigh, maybe extending your left arm out long, looking over your fingertips. Breathing, noticing what softens as you guide your breath towards your spine, your hips. And then inhale, slowly bring your knees back to center. And then on an exhale, lower your knees towards your left side. This time maybe looking over your right shoulder, along the length of your right arm, over your right fingertips. Keeping your breath. Becoming aware of any noises in your space or in mine, and simply noticing that they're there, but not attaching to them, letting them go. Have to tell myself that, so I let them go. On an inhale, bring your legs back to center. Lower your feet to the earth, maybe taking a full body stretch here, just lengthening all the way on your mat from the tips of your toes to the tips of your fingers, just feeling that full long body stretch. And if there's one more posture you'd like to take before we come into Shavasana, maybe a happy baby, or maybe just simply hugging knees into chest, go ahead and take that pose now. Otherwise, begin to make your way into your final resting pose, returning any clothing items you might need, or putting a blanket over your hips if that feels good to you, or maybe even changing up the pose and taking legs up the wall. It's your practice, your way, and you have the video to make Shavasana as long as you want. So, coming into your breath, I'm going to read our reading a third and final time. This time, inviting you to notice any words or phrase that continue to catch your attention, or if there's a new word or phrase that jumps out at you. Jesus, again in reply, spoke to the chief priests and elders of the people in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. He dispatched his servants to summon the invited guests to the feast, but they refused to come. A second time he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those invited, behold, I have prepared my banquet. My calves and fattened cattle are killed, and everything is ready. Come to the feast.' Some ignored the invitation and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, The rest laid hold of his servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged and sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. Then he said to his servants, "The feast is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy to come. Go out, therefore, into the main roads, and invite to the feast whomever you find." The servants went out into the streets and gathered all they found, bad and good alike, and the hall was filled with guests. Let any words or phrases that have been your intention for prayer and practice, or any new words or phrases coming to you now, let them settle, offering them to God in a prayer of thanks, in a prayer of praise, or maybe even a prayer of petition. You may choose to pause the video here to continue your own Shavasana. If you're moving with us, I invite you to bring your awareness back to your breath, back to the room that you're in. Maybe making small movements with your fingers and toes, your hands and feet. Maybe taking a full body stretch. When you're ready, turn yourself to whichever side is calling to you this morning, savoring and resting in this prayerful practice for a few moments longer. Thanking God for his loving presence, knowing that he's always near, but allowing yourself to feel particularly held in this moment. When you're ready, use the strength of your arms and legs to will yourself back up to a seated position on the mat. You can keep your eyes closed or your gaze focused down and inward. Let's extend our arms to the sky and draw our hands together, letting them rest at heart center. We raise our hands to our forehead. May God's word be on our minds. We draw our hands to our lips. May God's word be on our lips. And we return our hands to heart center. May God's word be in our hearts. We continue to pray for an end to this pandemic, and we continue to pray for ourselves, our loved ones, strangers, and enemies. All have open hearts to the invitation that God has for us. Our practice is complete as we bow to our God and one another and say, Namaste.